At this point in the U.S., our schools and media have become so bad that any accurate discussion of what capitalism and socialism really are almost sounds like revisionism. But fortunately for us, our own senior fellow, Dr. Tom DiLorenzo, is particularly well suited to that task, and he's got a great new book out called The Problem with Socialism. It's a great read, and he recently gave a fantastic talk on the book at Mises University entitled 10 Things Millennials Should Know About Socialism. We think you'll enjoy it, so stay tuned.
This talk is related to my new book, The Problem with Socialism. And the idea for this book came from, some of you might be familiar. There have been opinion polls. There was a Pew Foundation poll that said 69% of voters under 30 said they could vote for a socialist for president in the United States. And there was a YouGov.com poll of millennials, that is people born between 1982 and 2004. 43% of them said they preferred socialism over capitalism. And so my publisher, Regnery Publishing, they contacted me and we talked about the need for a book that would explain why this is a bad idea. So marketing a book to the millennials in particular. And my editor there said, we want every conservative parent to buy this book and give it to their kids before they go off to college, which the schools are. In one of the blurbs for the book, Walter Williams wrote that, here's what he wrote: it's a worthwhile investment for parents with college-age children to buy 2 copies, and one for them and one for the kids. And then he said he calls universities socialist indoctrination camps. And before you send your child off to socialist indoctrination camp, give them some ammunition, intellectual ammunition. And so that's the purpose of the book. And so what I thought I'd do today is that an alternative title for the talk could be How to Argue with Your Bernie Sanders Following Roommates Back at School, something like along those lines. And so it's 16 short chapters. They're short, but I tried to make them as concise as possible, and there are several hundred footnotes to the book. So it's based on all of our literature, but written up in a sort of an economics in one lesson type of style. So I'm going to go over some, as many of these as I can get through. Some of the, 1 or 2 of these, this crowd probably doesn't need to hear about too much, but I'm going to do it anyway because we have a diverse crowd here. But first of all, what is socialism? All these the millennials who say, "Yeah, socialism is a good thing for my future." I like to assume they don't really know what it is, and that if they do learn, they'll change their minds. But what it is, the way I define it, is, first of all, it includes the traditional definition of government ownership of the means of production. So any nationalized industries, government-run industries. And I do have a chapter called Islands of Socialism. It's about government-run enterprises. They're not nationalized, but it's the state government or the local government, hospitals, schools, all the things that governments run. But then in the 1976 edition of The Road to Serfdom, Hayek wrote that the meaning of socialism had evolved by that time to include government income redistribution programs through the welfare state and the progressive income tax. And he said that the goal was always ostensibly equality, the pursuit of material equality. Egalitarianism was always the goal, but the means evolved from nationalization of industry to the welfare state and the progressive income tax. And the progressive income tax, of course, is plank number 2 in the Communist Manifesto. Plank number 1 is abolition of private property. And then the second most important goal of Marx and Engels was a progressive income tax in capitalist economies, because they thought it would help to destroy capitalist economy, undermine capitalist economies. So part number 1 is nationalized industries. Part number 2 is the welfare state and the progressive income tax. And then I also include what Mises said in his book, Socialism. In one of the latter chapters, he said that socialists have always had a dual strategy. The first part of the strategy was to nationalize as much as possible, to have the government run as much as possible. The second part of the strategy is what Mises calls destructionism, to destroy the private property, free enterprise system with heavy taxes, heavy regulations, inflation, whatever works. Taking over the educational system and brainwashing the kids with the virtues of socialism and the evils of markets, whatever works, destructionism. And so with that definition, it's not the old early 20th century definition of government ownership of the means of production. It's much broader. So I have 16 chapters in the book, 16 short. It covers a lot of ground. If you look up the website of Democratic Socialists of America, for example, they highlight a super minimum wage as one of their top objectives. And so that's not government ownership of the means of production, but it's a government mandated $15 an hour minimum wage. And so, I take it from the horse's mouth, in other words, by looking up what the socialists of our day are saying they want. And just last night, Hillary Clinton looked at Bernie Sanders and said, "Your cause is our cause," to Bernie. And so I guess you could look at the Democratic Party platform and a lot of the Republican platform as being socialism or socialistic as far as that goes. So that's what it is. Point number 2 I wrote down here, I probably don't need to explain this to this group, that socialism will destroy your economic future. And so I write a little bit about the history of the Soviet Union, for example. Our friend Yuri Maltsev, who has taught at Mises University in the past, was an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev, who defected from the Soviet Union. And when he defected, he ends up, it's a very interesting story. I don't have time here to tell Yuri's story, but he ends up in the office of Dick Cheney, who was the defense secretary at the time. And he told Cheney that the Soviet economy was no more than 5% of the U.S. economy. And Yuri's story is that, Cheney says, our CIA says it's more like 50%. And Yuri was insistent, no, 5%. And he was right. And so the country with the largest natural resource base on the planet really had no economy. It's 5% of our economy at most, and it never produced a single product marketable on international markets, with the exception of possibly of caviar, but that comes from a fish and not a factory. And so it'll certainly ruin your economic future. And I also talk about, when India gained its independence, they adopted a sort of a Soviet-style 5-year economic plans, and India became synonymous with third world poverty. But India was once one of the wealthiest countries on earth, a long time ago, but when they had more economic freedom. They've made improvements since those days, but it was a terrible disaster that they went in that direction. Africa did the same thing. After colonization ended, all these African countries adopted socialism of one form or another in central planning. And if you're interested in that particular topic, one of the authors that I cite is George Ayite, who's written many books on this. Last I was in touch with George, he was teaching at American University in Washington, D.C., and he's from Ghana, but he's been in the U.S. for many years. So if you're interested in that, you can read George. And he's written books on how Africans had a culture of entrepreneurship and individualism, before colonialism. And instead of going back to that culture, their governments embraced socialism and central planning, and the rest is history. And so if you want to destroy your economic future, there's no shortage of examples. Argentina did the same thing. The latest example would be Venezuela, which I'll talk about in a minute. Point number 3 is you cannot fix socialism. I've been at this quite a while, and if I write op-eds criticizing some government program or some government regulation or legislation or something like that, I will inevitably get email from somebody who says, but we can fix this, we can get smarter people in charge, or we can do it like they did it over there in that country or something like that. But the thing about socialism, of course, is there are inherent reasons why it inevitably fails as an economic system, regardless of who's in charge. And I lay it out in my book to a lay audience. And, the 3 basic reasons are the incentive problem, the old incentive problem. And I don't know, maybe some of you have heard this story before, but if we used socialism to grade the exams at Mises University, We have these written exams, and then tomorrow we start the oral exams. What we would do would that we would tell the faculty when we do the oral exams tomorrow, give each student a number of points, maybe from 1 to 10. If you're an A+ student, you get 10 during our interview with you, okay? And then we'll add up all the points, divide by the number of students, and give every student There are things like 180% sales tax on cars when you buy a car. National sales tax, I think, is 25%. And he said the total tax take that this Danish economist I quote is about 70%. And so, the government takes 70% of your income. And so, in following my friend Walter Williams, I would point out that a good definition of slavery is forcing a person to work for the benefit of another person. That's a pretty good definition of slavery. Now, the real slaves were slaves for 12 months out of the year, but the Danes are slaves for just 70% of the year, so they're not quite as bad off as real slaves. They're only slaves to other people for 70% of the year instead of 30% of the year. And of course, they get something back from this, I guess. And Hayek addressed this whole issue of democratic socialism to explain that it's like oil and water. Socialism eats away at and destroys democracy eventually. And I'll read you one little passage from Hayek to give you some idea of the type of thing that he says about this. He said, the democratic statesman who sets out to plan economic life, socialism, will soon be confronted with the alternative of either assuming dictatorial powers or abandoning his plans and admitting failure. He would soon have to choose between disregard of ordinary morals and failure. It is for this reason that the unscrupulous and uninhibited are likely to be more successful in a socialist society. This is from The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. And so, for the reason I gave earlier, socialism always fails. And then the politicians never admit failure and they never give up. They grab more power. And a lot of the public will want a strong man. The public will come out in favor, we need a strong man or a strong woman to be in charge and become more dictatorial. And of course, that's the opposite of what we think of as democracy. And so that's just one of the reasons. Hayek gave quite a few others, but I don't have the time to go into a review of The Road to Serfdom here in this lecture. But that's just one part of his logic of how socialism is actually destructive of democracy. It's not compatible. Point number 5 I would make is it's false. It's false that socialism produces equality, and I deny that it's even a moral objective. I think it's an immoral objective. I have a chapter entitled Egalitarianism versus Human Nature. And of course, we're all different. We're all made different. We all have different interests and degrees of intelligence and strength and biological characteristics and so forth. So when a government devotes itself to the pursuit of forceful equality, it becomes more and more totalitarian because that's the only way you can get it. And what it really has become, the push for equality, is sort of a war on the division of labor, a war on the international division of labor, which is what makes the economic world go around. We all specialize in something in our work lives. We make money doing that, and then we trade with other people who specialize in other things. If we didn't do that, it's what keeps human civilization together, as Mises wrote in Human Action, the international division of labor. So the socialists, like Marx and Engels, knew what they were doing when they attacked the division of labor in the name of equality, which always sounds so nice, equality. They knew they were destroying the heart of the capitalist system that keeps human civilization together, the international division of labor. Okay, and so that's why they went after it. And I quote more than just economists in this chapter. For example, I quote H.L. Mencken in one page. And since I have an opportunity to quote H.L. Mencken, and not all of you are familiar with H.L. Mencken, so I'll introduce you to something. The story has it that Murray Rothbard, on his wedding night with his wife Joey, spent the whole night laying in bed reading H.L. Mencken quotes to each other and laughing their heads off. and I believe it's a true story. I think it was Joey that told us that years ago, probably at a Mises University. I always wonder if that's why they never had children, myself. But who knows? I didn't know them that well. But anyway, so Mencken was Murray's favorite writer as far as people who really had a touch for bashing the state. And here's one of the things he said, the great Mencken, about this topic of equality and egalitarianism. He said, all government in its essence is a conspiracy against the superior man. Its one permanent object is to oppress him and cripple him. If it be aristocratic in organization, then it seeks to protect the man who is superior only in law against the man who is superior in fact. If it be democratic, then it seeks to protect the man who is inferior in every way against both. One of the primary functions is to regiment men by force, to make them as much alike as possible and as dependent upon one another as possible, to search out and combat originality among men. All it can see in an original idea is potential change, and hence an invasion of its prerogatives, that is, invasion of government's prerogatives. The most dangerous man to any government is the man who is able to think things out for himself without regard to the prevailing superstitions and taboos. End quote. That's what political correctness is all about, isn't it? To censor all these criticisms of the superstitions and taboos that we're all supposed to believe in at the hands of the state. And that reminds me of another thing Hayek said in The Road to Serfdom, is that under any kind of collectivism, whether you call it socialism or fascism or anything, there's sort of the end of truth. One of the chapters is called The End of Truth, because truth becomes something that is handed down by the state and is enforced by its enforcers in the media and academia and elsewhere. It's not something that is discovered through discussion and conversation, research and learning. It's something that is told to us by the state, and then anybody who questions that is dealt with. And that's under socialism in one way or the other. And that really is what political correctness is all about, isn't it? I also cite Kurt Vonnegut as a non-economist here, and in his famous essay, Harrison Bergeron, who sort of spoofs the whole idea of equality, forced equality at the hand of the state. Not equality under the law, but the state's attempts to make everybody equal in some way. And here's what Vonnegut said. He said, the year was 2081, and everyone was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal in every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anyone else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilance of the agents of the United States Handicapper General. And so the Handicapper General worked as follows. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. But George, while his intelligence was way above normal, he had a little mental handicap radio in his ear, put there by the government. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains. End quote. And then I finally quote Murray Rothbard after this as saying the reason why writers like this sort of spoof egalitarianism and forced equality and make it sound like a nightmarish thing is because it is a nightmarish thing. And Rothbard wrote, when the implications of such a world are fully spelled out, we recognize that such a world and such attempts are profoundly anti-human. Being anti-human in the deepest sense, the egalitarian goal is therefore evil, and any attempts in a direction of such a goal must be considered as evil as well. And so the governments always fail to do anything but make everybody equally miserable under socialism. But the political elite and their supporters in the so-called private sector always do very well. For example, you can read in the New York Times and a Wall Street Journal today that the wealthiest person in Venezuela, where upper middle class people are rooting through garbage in the streets looking for food, the wealthiest person in the country is the 35-year-old daughter of the late Hugo Chavez, who is worth reportedly $4.2 billion, even though she never ran a business or had a job, as far as I know. The former Treasury Minister of Venezuela is reportedly worth $11 billion. even though he was in the same situation. I'm sure he didn't create $11 billion of value for anybody or any value at all. They just stole the money. And so in the latest big, long New York Times article about Venezuela that I read, there were about 10 pages of pictures of all these awful pictures of the poor people scrounging for food and things like that. And at the same time, there were pictures of Hugo Chavez's political pals all joining country clubs, the Caracas Country Club, where it would cost like the equivalent of $70,000 to join, and they're just having a good old time because that's what socialism does. It's always been like it was true in Russia, it's true in Africa, India, wherever it has been. You've got a grotesque inequality. Look at all the Latin American countries. You've got this elite at the top who lives high on the hog, and then everybody else, there's no middle class. Everybody else is in the lower class. That's the model. Okay. Your classmates and your roommates, when you go back to college, should know that your professors who always take the moral high road by touting socialism and criticizing markets are associating themselves with an ideology that is responsible for the worst crimes in all of human history. That there's a book called The Black Book of Communism that you can read about these crimes in. There's read a book called Death by Government by R.J. Rummel. He also has a website. You can just Google Death by Government. What a depressing career that must have been. He spent his whole career calculating how many people were murdered by their own governments throughout the world, and he has huge websites, several books about it. And just to give you some idea of the magnitude of this, the next time one of your professors takes the moral high road and goes, in promoting socialism, the Russians murdered 20 million of their own people. These are not war deaths. These are murders of dissenters to socialism. China, 60 million, Vietnam, 1 million, North Korea, 2 million, Cambodia, 2 million, Eastern Europe, 1 million. They were pretty good in Eastern Europe. Latin America, a mere 150,000, Africa, 1.7 million. And Rummel calls this democide. It's a death by government. And I also had one big long paragraph that I quoted from one of these studies of sort of the methods of torture that were also used to against dissenters. And so that's something that nobody knows. I gave some of my students this. I teach a course called Capitalism and Its Critics, and I have them read some of the bad guy stuff. I have them read the Communist Manifesto and then parts of Socialism by Mises, and go back and forth like that. And I gave them a table from R.J. Rummel's book to let them know about this. And a couple of these guys were in the college Republicans, and they had one of these days where all the clubs on campus have a little booth out on the quad, and they hand out literature or something, or sell cupcakes or whatever they do. And of all the things, they were giving out my handout of the death by government handout to all the students who are walking by, instead of selling cookies or something like that. And they told me that nobody knew anything about this. None of their classmates knew anything about this. They thought there was communists were all like Bernie Sanders, like cute little grandfather types, that you see at Christmas. That's they're such big sweetie pies. And so I don't know how much progress they made there, but that's what they did. I guess I'm on point number 7, is fascism is a form of socialism. One of the most evil words in the English language, fascism. Hayek called it a violent anti-capitalistic attack, fascism. After all, the Nazis were the National Socialist German Workers' Party. That National Socialism is what Nazi stood for. And so Hitler called himself a socialist. Although fascism was just a version of socialism, it was National Socialism. The Russians called themselves International Socialists. And by the way, they didn't call their government communist. They called it the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They didn't call it the Union of Soviet Communist Republics. Communism was the utopian ideal of Karl Marx, that they hoped to reach someday when nirvana would be attained. But in the meantime, they're all socialists. And when the Soviet Union finally imploded, Mikhail Gorbachev was going to Lithuania and Estonia and all these, the possessions of the Soviet Union, and he was telling them, go ahead and do whatever you want as long as it's consistent with socialism. He didn't say consistent with communism. He said socialism. So they always considered themselves socialists, not communists. We called them communists in this country. And the fascists all came from communism. For example, I quote Mussolini here. And so my critics will probably say, don't read his book. He quotes Mussolini, as the implication being I quote him favorably, which I don't. I also quote Hitler in this book too. Here's just one short quote from Mussolini in his book, Fascism, Doctrine and Institutions. I read his autobiography, by the way, and Mussolini was once he had a PhD in philosophy, political philosophy, and he wrote an autobiography, and it's kind of like if you gave a class of third graders the assignment to write an autobiography and put a title on it. The title he chose is My Autobiography by Benito Mussolini. It's how imaginative, PhD in political philosophy and my autobiography. So, but this book of fascism, the fascists knew who the enemy was. The enemy was classical liberalism. That was the enemy. It was Adam Smith, John Locke, all the early 20th century libertarians in political philosophy and economics. Here's what he said: the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with the state. It is opposed to classical liberalism. He literally said that, which denied the state in the name of the individual. Okay, so he opposed, in particular. I have another long quote in there from one of Mussolini's theorists, fascist theorists, who goes on and on denigrating what he called English liberalism. English liberalism, what is that? Adam Smith, John Locke, the whole philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment that is a big part of liberalism. And if you read Mises' book, Liberalism, you'll find that the fascists like Mussolini that I quote here and his other theorists, fascist theorists, they very harshly criticized every element of how Mises defines liberalism, classical liberalism, in his book, Liberalism, which is online, by the way. You could probably buy it out here in the bookstore, but it's also online on Mises.org. You can find it. And so fascism always was a form of socialism. If you look at what the German fascists did, they nationalized about half of all German industry, and the other half was so heavily regulated and controlled so that it operated for the state and not the individual, that Hayek wrote in The Road to Serfdom that they sort of de facto nationalized the whole industry, all of German industry, even though they had ostensibly private ownership of some of it. It was so heavily controlled. You had to produce what the Nazis told you to produce and how to produce it and who to sell it to and so on. And so it was de facto nationalization. And so how that ever came to be construed as capitalism, it's not really a wonder. They lied. They lied about it. There's nothing capitalistic at all about it. It was a violent attack on violent anti-capitalistic attack, as Hayek said. Point number 8 that I make in the book is socialist welfare harms the poor. You're probably all familiar with the incentive effect of welfare payments. I'll give you one anecdote. The Cato Institute did this study where they picked out 7 popular federal welfare programs out of 126, just 7 out of 126, and asked the question, well, how much money is that state by state? And in the highest state, Hawaii, it's $49,000. In the lowest welfare state, Mississippi, it's $18,000. So in Hawaii, that means if you're on welfare and you get $49,000 in money and in-kind benefits from the government for not working, if you want to get off welfare, you'd need a job that would pay you what, about $70,000 before taxes to break even. And so that's a pretty big incentive not to get off of welfare. And in Mississippi, which has a much lower cost of living, if you can make $18,000 by doing nothing, well, you'd have to make, maybe 25, 30,000. And if you're a high school dropout or you have little skill, that's going to be darn tough to get someone to pay you that kind of money. So why would you ever do that? Especially if you have children. Why would you ever do that and try it? And so a lot of people don't. So there's the work incentive effect. There's the family breakup effect of welfare that has eliminated the stigma that once existed that men had when they abandoned their children. And so as long as they get a government check that can let the mother and the children at least survive and get along, it has eliminated the stigma of that. So there's been a 400% increase in out-of-wedlock births since 1960 in the United States. And I cite literature, research that shows, some of the effects of that, or the children. We all know single mothers that have done a great job raising children. But in general, the research says that such children the girls are twice as likely to have out-of-wedlock children themselves, which could, since they're in poverty to begin with, a lot of them could make it very tough for them ever to get out of poverty. And the boys are 3 times more likely to be involved in crime in families like this. And those are just two of the statistics that I throw out in the book. And I also talk about the crowding out effect of the welfare state that displaces private charitable efforts that are usually much more effective in helping people who need help than government bureaucracies are. And so that's point number 8 about how the welfare state actually harms the poor, but it puts them right where the politicians want them, as dependent on them to be. And the more the better. The more the better. Let's see, I have time I might get through a couple of these. Point number 9 is the progressive income tax is social poison, I would call it. And again, you've all heard of probably the incentive effects of the progressive income tax that imposes progressively higher tax rates on the more productive people. So the idea is to tax the more productive people in society who therefore earn higher income at a higher rate, and then use the money to subsidize less productive or unproductive people. And we're not talking about disabled people here. We're talking about able-bodied, less productive people, and that's called tax fairness. That's called tax fairness. Take robbing people who work hard and so forth. So we have the phenomenon of the entrepreneur who goes broke 3 or 4 times trying to become a successful business person and finally hits upon a good product that it succeeds, and he makes a lot of money. And so what do we want to do with him? We want to tax his pants off. We want to put him in the 70% marginal tax bracket if we could someday. And so, or the novelist who writes 3, 4, or 5 novels and makes no money and finally writes a Tom Clancy novel. Okay, let's tax the daylights out of that person. And I will never forget years ago when I was at George Mason, we had a guest lecturer from Sweden. And I'll never forget this female novelist from Sweden who we were told was one of the most better known novelists in Sweden at the time. And she had just moved to the United States. And one of the faculty members there knew her somehow and brought her to the economics department to give a talk. And her talk was that the main reason she was moving to the United States is that she finally succeeded. She struggled for years and didn't sell many. And finally, she had a couple of novels that were big sellers. And her tax rate was 110%. So if she made $100,000 on a novel, she owed $110,000 in tax. And that's why she was living in Fairfax, Virginia at the time. We don't have anything like that in this country. But that's sort of the end game of where progressive income taxation takes you. But the most insidious part of the income tax in general, I quote Frank Chodorow, who wrote this great book, The Income Tax, Root of All Evil, which is for sale out here. It's also online, Chodorow, that when we adopted the income tax, the government basically said, we now own all of your income. They nationalized income. And we will tell you how much of your income you can keep by setting the tax rate. So the income was nationalized, and the federal government got a gigantic new source of income. There was no income tax in the original Constitution. And so what did that do? That led to a tremendous centralization of power, because now the government had all this income. Chodorov writes, for example, during the Civil War, there was a lot of soldiers in the U.S. Army went AWOL or just left the army, but Lincoln did not have the resources to hunt them down. But Chodorov writes, but after the income tax, the U.S. government does have the resources to hunt down, people who, leave the army and things like that. They also have the resources to bribe a lot of people, giving them government grants and threatening the withdrawal of the grants if they don't behave in the way the government wants them to behave. And that includes the state and local governments. And so Chodorov sees the income tax as something that was sort of the final nail in the coffin of American federalism or states' rights, and that it created this tremendous centralization of power in the central government. And centralized power is always the enemy of freedom. So I look at the income tax, the progressive income tax, much more broadly than just sort of the minor economic work incentive effect at the income tax.